Autonomous induction theory. The second of the models within the interactionist approach to second language learning is autonomous induction theory, presented by Carroll, Suzanne Carroll. Now, Carroll's model is an ambitious model which tries to explain all the processes that are involved in changing, for instance, the input into intake, and how does learning actually take place, and how do the learners move from one stage to the other. Carroll claims that understanding of second language acquisition, any model that is presented must also talk about the representation of language in mind. How is language represented in the minds of the learners? Then a theory must also talk about how is that language processed in the light of the new intake, both receptively and productively. By receptively, we mean when we talk to the learners or when they read something, how do they receive the information and how do they process it? And by productive language skills, we mean how do the learners produce the language, either by speaking or by writing. Carroll also attempts to answer the question, how our mental representations of language are altered in relation to the environmental input that comes to us. How do the learners actually readjust their interlanguage or appropriate their interlanguage when some sort of new information comes to them, either through direct instruction or a direct feedback, negative evidence, or a recast. In explaining this, however, Carroll rejects the parameter setting which the universal grammar proponents argued for. She said that is an inaccurate way of explaining how language is learned. Instead, she said the right way to explain how the learners learn the language or readjust what they already know in their interlanguage system is through inductive learning or I-learning. Now, what is inductive learning? Inductive learning means that through examples, by coming across different examples, you form a kind of a generalization or a hypothesis. So, learners learn a language when they see several examples or recurrence of a certain thing, and they form or reform their hypothesis or an assumption about how they need to express a similar meaning in a similar form. And she argues that this is what, this inductive learning, this learning from different examples that come to the learners in real life, actually is the only thing that explains how language is processed, both again receptively, that is, how do they understand the messages, interpret the messages, whether they are oral or written, and how do they produce messages or produce utterances which are which may be written or oral. So in this inductive learning model or autonomous inductive model, Carroll argues that universal grammar in highlighting that language is modular, that is, it has different parts or components, and it is represented in the mind in the form of modules is correct. However, it differs from other inductive theories by realizing that the representation in the minds of the learners that is already there has certain constraints. So those constraints affect the efficacy or the extent to which language is processed. That is, when new information comes, it has to deal with the challenge of the existing constraints in the mind of the learner in terms of a linguistic representation that is already there in the mind of the learner. So Carroll's model is more complex and more full than the input processing model presented by Van Patten.